"Officer, before this goes any further, tell me exactly what you think I did." Adrian Cole said it calmly. Within minutes, Officer Matthew Kessler would arrest him on that same Baltimore block. What Adrian did not yet know was how much the evidence would change before Kessler made that decision. It was shortly after 9 o'clock, and Adrian had been walking home from the transit area after a long day, his charcoal wool overcoat buttoned against the evening chill, his white dress shirt open at the collar, dark navy trousers still sharply pressed, and a slim black work bag hanging from one hand. He was 41, black, 6 feet tall, with close-cropped black hair and a neatly trimmed short beard. Until the patrol cruiser slowed beside him, the walk had been entirely ordinary. Kessler stepped out in a dark patrol uniform, his body camera visible above his duty belt. At 36, he was taller than Adrian, broad through the shoulders, with a muscular build, a sandy brown crew cut, and a clean-shaven face. "Set the bag down for a second," Kessler said. Adrian looked at him, then at the marked cruiser. "Am I being detained? I'm investigating something." "Put the bag down." Adrian lowered it carefully beside his shoes. He did not argue, but he did not pretend the distinction was unimportant either. "Am I being detained?" he asked again. This time Kessler answered, "Yes." A few minutes earlier, dispatch had reported an attempted vehicle break-in several blocks away. The first description was broad: a black adult male in dark outerwear carrying a dark bag, seen leaving the general area on foot. Adrian fit enough of it to justify questions, and he understood that. What he did not yet know was whether Kessler intended to use those questions to test the suspicion or merely confirm it. "What's your name?" Kessler asked. "Adrian Cole." "Where are you coming from?" Adrian indicated the direction behind him. "Transit. I'm walking home." Kessler studied him. "You live around here?" "Yes." "You have identification?" Adrian paused only long enough to make sure he understood the request, then reached slowly for his wallet after Kessler permitted him to do so. "I do." He handed over his identification without volunteering anything about his profession. There was no reason his occupation should determine whether the facts were checked correctly. Kessler glanced at the card and then back at Adrian. "What's in the bag?" "Work materials and personal belongings." "From where?" "From work." Adrian kept his voice level. He could hear radio traffic from Kessler's shoulder microphone, fragments of locations and descriptions passing too quickly to assemble into a complete picture. He resisted the temptation to fill the silence. Instead, he looked directly at Kessler and said, "You have my name, my address, and where I came from. If this is about an incident nearby, you should be able to determine whether I could have been there." That was not a challenge. It was the simplest path forward Adrian could see. Kessler held his identification and looked toward his cruiser as another transmission came through. Adrian remained beside his bag, aware now that he could not simply continue walking. Whatever had begun as a police officer asking questions had crossed a clear line. Officer Matthew Kessler had formally detained him. Kessler returned to his cruiser with Adrian's identification and ran the information through the department system, while Adrian remained beside his work bag under the street lamp. Less than a minute later, the result came back clean. The name matched the identification. The Baltimore address Adrian had given was valid, and there were no outstanding warrants attached to him. Kessler stepped back onto the sidewalk, still holding the card. "How long ago did you get off transit?" he asked. "About 10 minutes ago," Adrian said. "Which stop?" Adrian told him. Kessler glanced toward the intersection, mentally placing the location. "And you came straight from there?" "Yes." Adrian pointed down the block. "I walked along the main road, turned there, and continued this way." Kessler asked him to describe the route again, this time more specifically. Adrian did. His answers remained consistent, and the route made geographical sense for someone traveling from the transit area toward the address printed on his identification. None of that proved where Adrian had been every minute of the evening, but it gave Kessler something concrete to verify instead of relying only on a broad physical description. Kessler keyed his shoulder microphone. "Can you confirm the reported location and direction of travel?" Dispatch responded with the block where the attempted vehicle break-in had been reported and the direction the caller initially believed the man had gone. Kessler looked down the street, then back toward the route Adrian had described. The information did not line up neatly. It was not enough by itself to eliminate Adrian, because the original caller's account was still preliminary, but it did make the assumption less certain than it had been when Kessler first stepped from the cruiser. Adrian heard the exchange. "That is not the direction I came from," he said. "I heard you." Kessler's tone was controlled, but more guarded now. "Then you also know my identification checks out, and my route makes sense. Your identification tells me who you are. It does not tell me where you were 15 minutes ago." Adrian considered that before answering. On its own, the statement was fair. He knew that a clean record did not establish an alibi, and he had no intention of pretending otherwise. "That is true," he said. "So check the timing against the locations." Kessler studied him for a moment. Adrian could feel the balance of the encounter beginning to change, not because he had established that Kessler had no reason to investigate, but because the facts were no longer moving in the direction of the original suspicion. His identity was confirmed. His stated destination matched his address. His route was plausible, and the first location information from dispatch did not fit comfortably with where Kessler had encountered him. Still, Adrian remained detained. Kessler returned his attention to the radio instead of releasing him. "Dispatch, do we have anything more specific from the witness?" There was a short pause while the dispatcher checked the updated call information. Adrian said nothing. Kessler had checked the information Adrian could reasonably provide at the scene, and now they were waiting for something more specific. Then the radio came alive again. "Unit, stand by. We have an updated description from the witness." The dispatcher returned less than 30 seconds later. Updated witness description. Suspect was wearing a dark hooded jacket, light-colored athletic shoes, and appeared to have no facial hair. Witness says he moved east from the reported location. Kessler did not respond immediately. Adrian stood beneath the street lamp in a charcoal wool overcoat, black leather shoes, and a neatly trimmed short beard that was clearly visible from several feet away. More importantly, he had approached the block from the transit area along a route that did not match the updated direction of travel. None of those differences alone could establish exactly where the unknown suspect had gone, but together they changed the factual picture considerably. "Copy," Kessler finally said into his microphone. Adrian waited until the transmission ended. "That description does not match me. Parts of it still do." "The first description did," Adrian replied. "The updated one is telling you something different." Kessler looked toward Adrian's work bag. "You still match the broad profile. Black male, dark outerwear, dark bag. And now you have differences in clothing, shoes, facial hair, direction, and the route I gave you." Adrian kept his voice controlled. He was not trying to win an argument on the sidewalk. He wanted Kessler to do what new information required: reassess the original assumption. Kessler had already confirmed Adrian's identity and address. He had heard Adrian describe a plausible route home. Now dispatch had supplied additional details that weakened the identification further. Adrian looked directly at him. "Am I free to go?" Kessler hesitated. "Not yet." That answer changed the encounter for Adrian more than anything Kessler had said before it. At first, Adrian had accepted that a nearby reported crime and a broad description could justify an officer asking questions. He had cooperated because verification was the fastest reasonable way to separate coincidence from evidence. But the process had now produced information, and that information was moving away from him as a suspect. "What specifically are you still trying to establish?" Adrian asked. "I am finishing my investigation. Based on what information that still points to me?" Kessler's expression tightened. "I told you that you were detained. Stay where you are." Adrian did. He understood that the sidewalk was not the place to physically test police authority, and he had no intention of doing so. But compliance did not require silence. "Then I want it clear that dispatch updated the description before you decided to continue holding me." Kessler glanced briefly toward the body camera on his uniform. "The camera is recording." "Good." Adrian let the word stand. "If you believe there is still a lawful basis to keep me here, tell me what it is. And if you are not prepared to release me after that update, I want a supervisor requested." Kessler reached for his radio, then lowered his hand from the microphone and looked at him. The question was no longer whether new information would arrive. It already had. Now Kessler had to decide what he was going to do with it. Kessler held Adrian's gaze for a moment, then made his decision. "I am not calling a supervisor right now." Adrian did not move. "Then state the basis for continuing the detention." "You were found near the area, you matched elements of the original description, and I am still investigating." After dispatch gave you an updated description that does not match me in several material ways. Kessler's jaw tightened. Turn around. Adrian understood immediately that the encounter had changed again. Am I under arrest? Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Adrian complied. He did not pull away or raise his voice. Kessler secured the handcuffs around Adrian's wrists and checked their fit. The restraint was brief and controlled, but its meaning was unmistakable. Adrian was no longer standing on a Baltimore sidewalk waiting for an officer to finish checking facts. He was in custody. What am I being arrested for? Adrian asked. Kessler told him he was under arrest in connection with the attempted vehicle break-in, saying he believed the total circumstances gave him probable cause to proceed. Adrian looked toward the body camera on Kessler's uniform. Then I want the record clear. Dispatch updated the description before you put me in handcuffs. It is recorded, Kessler said. And I complied with your instructions. I did not say you did not. That answer mattered. Kessler was not claiming Adrian had attacked him, fled, or physically resisted. The decision rested on Kessler's assessment that the remaining facts still amounted to probable cause, despite the information that had weakened the original identification. Adrian felt anger rising, but he forced himself to stay precise. He had spent the encounter assuming that each verified fact would narrow the officer's uncertainty. Instead, the uncertainty seemed to be operating in only one direction. Details that supported the initial suspicion remained important. Details that weakened it were treated as reasons to keep investigating. My bag stays closed unless you have lawful authority to search it, Adrian said. I am not consenting to anything beyond what the law permits. Kessler picked up the slim black work bag and secured it for transport without opening it on the sidewalk. You can address that during processing. Adrian did not debate him. The important facts had already happened in sequence, and the camera had been present for all of them. The original description, the identity check, the route discussion, the updated witness information, Adrian asking whether he was free to leave, and Kessler deciding that he was not. Kessler guided Adrian toward the patrol cruiser and opened the rear door. Adrian paused before getting inside. Officer Kessler, I asked for the basis of the continued detention after the updated description. I asked for a supervisor. I followed your instructions. I want all of that preserved. Get in the car, Mr. Cole. Adrian sat down, and Kessler closed the door. Through the window, Adrian watched the street lamp and the patch of sidewalk where his walk home had ended. A few minutes earlier, Kessler had possessed only a broad description and uncertainty. Since then, the available information had become more specific, and much of it had moved away from Adrian. Yet the consequence had moved in the opposite direction. When the cruiser pulled away from the curb, the question was no longer whether Kessler would escalate the stop. He already had. The question now was whether the official record would preserve the same sequence Adrian had just lived through. The processing room was quiet enough that Adrian could hear the wall clock between questions. His handcuffs had been removed, his work bag had been placed with his property, and an officer at the desk was entering routine information into the department system. Adrian answered each question without argument. Name, address, date of birth, emergency contact. Then the officer asked, occupation. Adrian replied, Assistant United States Attorney with the Department of Justice, assigned to the Criminal Division of the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland. The officer looked up briefly, not with alarm, but with the natural pause of someone hearing an unexpected answer. Federal prosecutor? Yes. The officer entered the information and verified what could be confirmed through normal channels. Adrian did not ask for special treatment, and he did not demand that anyone call Washington. His profession could change what Adrian knew to preserve next, but it could not change the facts Kessler had possessed on the sidewalk. The more immediate question was whether police could actually connect him to the attempted vehicle break-in. They could not. The updated witness description remained inconsistent with Adrian in several material respects. The reported direction of travel did not fit his route from transit, and no additional information emerged tying him to the vehicle or the location of the attempt. After the available information was reviewed, Adrian was told he would be released. Relief came first, but it lasted only a moment. He had expected facts to resolve the encounter on the sidewalk. Instead, they were resolving it after he had already been detained, handcuffed, transported, and processed. Before leaving, Adrian asked how to obtain the incident and arrest documentation. Then he became more specific. I also want to make sure the body camera recording, dispatch audio, computer-aided dispatch timestamps, and communications associated with the call are preserved. The officer regarded him more carefully now. You can make a formal records request and file a complaint. I intend to follow the proper process, Adrian said. I am asking that the relevant records not be lost under any routine retention schedule while that happens. He wrote down the incident information he was given and confirmed the procedure for submitting the complaint. There was no dramatic confrontation. No supervisor rushed into the room to apologize. Kessler did not suddenly appear to explain himself. Adrian preferred it that way. He wanted the records untouched by theater. When his property was returned, he checked the slim black work bag, put on his charcoal overcoat, and walked out with the same belongings he had been carrying when Kessler stopped him. Outside, the Baltimore night felt colder than before. Adrian stood for a moment and reconstructed the sequence from memory. The initial description, the identification check, the questions about his route, the updated witness information, his request to leave, his request for a supervisor, the handcuffs, the transport. His legal training told him not to confuse memory with proof, even his own. That was precisely why the records mattered. A body camera could establish words and actions. Dispatch audio could establish what information had been transmitted. Computer-aided dispatch data could establish when it had been transmitted. The written report would establish how the arrest was later described. Adrian started home again, no longer under Kessler's authority. But he understood that the most important part of the encounter might now exist outside either man's memory. If the official report told the same story as the timestamps and recordings, the record would speak for itself. If it did not, the difference would become the next question. Within days, Adrian submitted a formal complaint and requested the records connected to his detention and arrest. The review did not begin with his position at the Department of Justice. It began with the same question Adrian had asked on the sidewalk. What information did Officer Matthew Kessler actually have when he decided to escalate? Kessler's written report provided one version. It described Adrian as matching significant elements of the original suspect description and presented the continuing detention as part of an active effort to determine whether he was connected to the attempted vehicle break-in. The report also noted that additional information had arrived during the encounter. Nothing in the report amounted to an obvious confession of wrongdoing. The problem appeared when investigators placed it beside the preserved records. Kessler maintained that the witness description was changing and that some original characteristics still matched Adrian. That gave the review a concrete dispute to resolve, not whether Kessler had been certain, but whether the information he possessed at the moment of arrest still supported the decision he made. A second issue emerged from the wording of the report. Read by itself, the narrative made the evidence supporting suspicion feel continuous, as though the information available at the beginning of the stop remained essentially intact through the arrest. The recordings suggested a more complicated progression. Information had changed during the encounter, and the timing of those changes mattered. Adrian resisted the urge to argue the case from memory. "Do not take my sequence over his," he said during the review process. "Use the records." That choice shifted the dispute away from two competing personal accounts. Investigators now had a practical method for resolving the central factual question without deciding whose recollection sounded more convincing. They could align the original dispatch call, each update, Kessler's body camera, the computer-aided dispatch entries, and the written report against a single clock. If the report accurately reflected the information available when Kessler acted, the synchronized record would show it. If the report made later events appear earlier, minimized information already received, or blurred the point at which the justification weakened, that would show too. The review therefore moved to the one test neither Adrian nor Kessler could control after the fact, reconstructing the encounter minute by minute. The synchronized record showed the change with unusual clarity. Kessler's initial stop preceded the verification that supported Adrian's account. The dispatch update materially weakening the identification came next. Body camera audio then captured Adrian asking whether he was free to leave and requesting the basis for continued detention. Only after those events did Kessler escalate to arrest. The handcuffing and arrest were therefore not decisions made before the contradictory information arrived. They came afterward. That distinction was the center of the review. Kessler's explanation remained part of the record. He had argued that witness descriptions could change, that some original characteristics still matched, and that officers sometimes had to act before every uncertainty was resolved. Investigators did not reject those principles outright. Instead, they examined whether they adequately explained this particular decision. The problem was cumulative. Information supporting suspicion had been treated as significant, while multiple pieces of information weakening suspicion had not produced a comparable reassessment before the escalation. The written report became important for a second reason. Its wording was not a simple fabrication, but by compressing the sequence, it made the continuing suspicion appear more stable than the synchronized records showed it had been. The objective timeline preserved something the narrative alone did not: the exact point at which Kessler knew the factual picture had materially changed. Adrian read the preliminary findings without satisfaction. He had wanted the verification to work on the sidewalk, not weeks later in a review. Still, the central factual dispute was finally settled without anyone needing to accept his memory over Kessler's. The department's own records showed what had happened and when. As the administrative review moved forward, Kessler was removed from ordinary street duty, pending the next stage of the process. It was not an instant firing, nor was it a final disciplinary judgment. It was a consequence of a documented question that could no longer be dismissed as two men remembering the same night differently. For the first time since the cruiser had stopped beside Adrian, the central issue was no longer what happened. The records had answered that. The question now was what consequences should follow from what the department could prove about its own officer's decision. Once the department's own records established the sequence, Adrian made a decision that moved the dispute beyond the administrative review. Through the appropriate civil process, he filed a civil lawsuit seeking $15 million in damages over the detention and arrest. The amount was a demand, not a verdict, settlement, or guaranteed payment, and Adrian was careful about that distinction. The lawsuit focused on the detention and arrest, the information available to Kessler before the arrest, and the department's responsibility for the conduct its own records had documented. Any broader allegation about supervision, training, or departmental practices would have to be supported through the legal process rather than assumed from one encounter. Adrian wanted the case built that way. He had no interest in turning a documented failure into an exaggerated accusation that the evidence could not sustain. The synchronized timeline remained the foundation. Kessler had received an initial description that reasonably justified investigation. Verification then supported significant parts of Adrian's account. Dispatch supplied materially different identifying details and direction of travel information. Kessler heard that update. Only afterward did he continue the detention and escalate to arrest. Those facts were stronger than outrage because they could be checked against records created before anyone knew the encounter would become a legal dispute. The $15 million demand changed the institutional stakes. What had begun with one patrol officer's decision on a Baltimore sidewalk now required the department and its legal representatives to confront possible civil liability tied to that decision. But Adrian resisted one interpretation almost immediately. His occupation began appearing prominently whenever the case was summarized: Assistant United States Attorney Adrian Cole. He understood why. A federal prosecutor being arrested while walking home was an easy detail to emphasize. It was unusual, memorable, and likely to attract attention. Yet every time Adrian saw his job placed at the center of the story, he felt the argument becoming weaker in a different way. His profession had helped him recognize which records mattered and how quickly they should be preserved. It had not changed what Kessler knew before placing him under arrest. During a discussion about how the civil claim should be presented, Adrian noticed that the first line once again identified him by his federal position before describing what the records showed. He read it twice, circled the phrase, and said nothing yet. The evidence had already settled what Kessler knew. Adrian was beginning to think the next argument was about what people believed made that evidence important. The administrative process continued separately, and Kessler remained away from ordinary street duty while the department considered the appropriate outcome. Adrian did not demand that those proceedings produce a predetermined punishment. Accountability, in his view, would mean little if it ignored procedure in the name of correcting a procedural failure. By then, The factual mystery that had driven the earlier review was gone. The recordings and timestamps had resolved it. The next phase was about consequence. What responsibility belonged to Kessler? What responsibility belonged to the institution? And what could fairly be supported by the evidence? Yet Adrian saw one more problem developing, and this time it was not hidden in a police report. Draft summaries of the case kept returning to the same phrase, giving it more prominence than the chronology itself. Assistant United States Attorney Adrian Cole. Adrian read the words again and decided that before the case could represent what he believed had gone wrong, he needed to change what people believed made it matter. Adrian made the change quietly. When another draft summary placed his federal position ahead of the facts, he asked that the language be rewritten so his occupation remained part of the record without becoming the reason the case deserved attention. If this only matters because I am a federal prosecutor, he said, then we are making the wrong argument. By then, the administrative process had reached its own conclusion. The department found that Kessler had legitimate grounds for the initial investigative stop, but that his later decision-making failed to give appropriate weight to materially contradictory information received before the arrest. The review also found that the written report did not adequately preserve how significantly the factual picture had changed during the encounter. Kessler received formal discipline and was required to complete remedial training before he could return to ordinary patrol duties. The department also adopted a focused supervisory review procedure for arrests arising from investigative stops when updated dispatch information materially weakens the original basis for suspicion. It was not a sweeping promise that mistakes would never happen again. It was a concrete response to the failure the records had exposed. The $15 million lawsuit continued through the legal process, with no instant settlement and no guarantee that Adrian would receive the amount sought. He was comfortable leaving that question where it belonged. Accountability did not require him to predict a verdict. What mattered to him was that the encounter had been examined according to evidence rather than status, and that consequences had followed decisions that could be documented. Months later, Adrian left work wearing the same kind of charcoal wool overcoat over a white dress shirt, dark navy trousers, and black leather shoes. He carried his slim black work bag and took transit before beginning the familiar walk home through Baltimore. When he reached the block where Kessler had stopped him, Adrian slowed. The street looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Cars moved through the intersection. Lights spilled from storefront windows. People passed without knowing his name or where he worked. For a moment, he remembered standing beneath that street lamp while another person decided whether the facts about him mattered. Then he continued walking. Months earlier, Adrian had believed that once the facts were checked, the system would correct itself. Walking that block again, he understood the difference. Facts could only protect someone when people were willing to let those facts change a decision. On that sidewalk, he was not Assistant United States Attorney Adrian Cole. He was simply Adrian Cole, a 41-year-old black man carrying a work bag home at night. And that, he had come to believe, was enough. He did not need a federal title to make an inaccurate assumption worth correcting. He did not need professional influence to make contradictory evidence worth hearing. His occupation had given him knowledge that helped him preserve the record afterward, but it had never been the reason the record mattered. The strongest thing Adrian had done was not reveal who he was. It was insist that the same facts available to everyone be placed in the correct order. Once they were, neither his position nor Kessler's badge could change what the timestamps showed. Adrian crossed the intersection and kept walking toward home, leaving the street lamp behind him without needing the night to become anything more than what it should have been from the beginning, an ordinary walk through his own city. Closing reflection. Sometimes the most important form of fairness is not believing one person automatically over another, but being willing to let new information change an old assumption. There are moments when certainty feels easier than reconsideration, especially after a decision has already been made. Yet this story suggests that dignity can live in something as simple as being willing to look again. Adrian's professional title made his experience unusual, but the deeper question had very little to do with his profession. Perhaps respect means allowing facts to matter before we know whether someone is influential, accomplished, connected, or completely unknown to us. Evidence can correct a record, but the willingness to respond to it may be what prevents the record from needing correction in the first place. And sometimes accountability is not about creating the harshest, Ending possible. It is about making sure a consequential decision is examined honestly, followed by a response that gives the next encounter a better chance to end differently. If you had been in Adrian's position, how would you have balanced protecting your rights with keeping the encounter from escalating? What part of his decision to focus on the evidence rather than his professional status stays with you most?